Welcome to Divisionalysis. I'm Fog. Today's my second last video that I'm going to leave the community with. A number of reasons for that, but over the period of I think this is my 26th video, I have probably made the situation worse by making everything appear more complicated than what it actually is. Today, hopefully, I'm going to go a little of the way to making up for that. It's still complicated, but today I'm going to give you the tools in which to uncomplicate it, and we're going to keep it simple. Let's go. Okay, let's start with some misconceptions, which we will complicate before we uncomplicate them. 200% damage output is what you get from 100% weapon damage. Now what I hear is terms like multiplicative and additive, and I honestly believe that this is actually confusing people more than it's helping them out in most cases. If I have 100% amplified damage and no other damage, the damage output that I produce is 200%. There is no difference between having 100% weapon damage only or having 100% amplified damage only. The damage output is still 200% damage. The power of multipliers comes when you choose and take from the different buckets. If I have 50% weapon damage and 50% amplified damage, now I am producing 225% damage output, because it is now 1.5 times 1.5. Before, in both cases, it was just 2 times. That's it. Now 1.5 times 1.5 gives me 225% damage output. And the more buckets that you take from, the more damage that you produce. If I have 33% weapon damage, 33% total weapon damage, and 33% amplified damage, I'm now producing 235% damage output, because it's 1.33 times 1.33 times 1.33. It's more to do with how many buckets you're taking from. At the end of the day, I'm still adding 33%, 33%, 33%, so a total of 100% of whatever it is. It's just that I'm taking it from different multiplying buckets. If I now have 25% amplified damage, 25% total weapon damage, 25% weapon damage, and now I have 25% average crit damage output, well, now I have between 195% damage and 293% damage, for an average of 244% damage. As you can see, the more buckets that you take from, the more damage that you're outputting. What people don't understand is that every single stat is multiplicative. Now this may confuse things a little bit more than what they have, but every single statistic in the division is multiplicative. Okay, first things first, let's talk about multiplicative. So if I have 100% base damage, I have 10% weapon damage, and I have 10% total weapon damage. What that means is that my output is 121% damage, because it is 1.1 times 1.1, because I have 2 different buckets, 2 different categories. They are now multiplying each other, and I'm getting the full value from both of them. If I add 10% weapon damage to our weapon damage bucket, now this is what is traditionally called additive damage. So I now get 132% damage. As you can see, I've added 10% weapon damage, but I've got 11% more damage output. And that's because although the 10% weapon damage was considered, in quotation marks, additive, it has multiplied across the entire build. And that's because every single category or bucket is multiplicative. I added 10% additive, in quotation marks, damage, but I got 11% increased damage output. That's because the category of weapon damage is multiplicative. It multiplies across the entire build. Now what I should have got for the full value of my 10% is I should have got 10% on 121% damage. I should not have gotten 11% damage, I should have got 12.1% damage. And that's because I'm getting diminished returns. So diminished returns, 100% base damage, 10% weapon damage, gives me the full value of my 10%, giving me 110% damage. Now, if I add to the same bucket, I still get the full 10%, and I'm now producing 120% damage. But what I asked for was 10% increase on damage, and the damage that I had before adding that 10% was 110% damage. I asked for 10% on that, and what I should have got was 11% increased damage output, but I only got 10. And this is where the idea of additive versus multiplicative comes about, where there is only one bucket. And in this case, 10% weapon damage added is actually additive, in that it only adds 10% damage. But as soon as there's other buckets involved, the return that you get from adding that weapon damage is greater than 10%, and it is no longer additive. It is just a diminished return. So the return that I got was diminished. Now, if instead I add 10% total weapon damage, a different category, I will now get the full return that I asked for, where I get 121% damage. So I think there is confusion, and I may have just muddied the waters a little bit more, but the bottom line is you want more buckets. Every bucket is multiplicative, as in it will multiply across the entire build. It's just that if you're adding to the same bucket, you will get diminished returns. 10% damage to target out of cover, 10% weapon damage, 25% total weapon damage, and 25% amplified damage gives me 189% damage output. Because I've got 4 buckets now, all of these giving me the full value of the amount that is inside the bucket. Now, the old Fox's Prayer versus Fenris, or whatever it happens to be. If I add the Fox's Prayer 8% to the damage out of cover, I get 203% damage. But if I add 10% to the weapon damage, I get 206% damage. And that's because the diminishing of the returns that I am getting is barely felt at all, because the buckets are quite empty. And so 10%, even at a diminished rate, is still more than 8% at a diminished rate. If I now up the weapon damage bucket to being more full, the diminishing return that I get is quite considerable now. And now the 8%, even though it is added to a bucket that has already got an amount into it, so I am not getting the full 8%. If I was getting the full 8%, it would have given me 371.5% damage. But it is slightly reduced or diminished because the bucket was already had something in it. 10% weapon damage, if I had got the full value of it, would have produced an extra 34.4% damage, but instead I only got 17%. The more full the bucket is, the more diminished the return is. And this is where more confusion exists, because if weapon damage was actually additive, I should have got exactly the same increase from adding 10% when it was only 10% in the bucket as what I did when there was 100% in the bucket. And one of the reasons why I'm not going to be making any more videos is because I have to do shit like this, where I have to explain every single tiny little detail in every video, because some petty individuals are going to try and pick up on it and either comment on it or make videos about it, and I've just invited too much negativity into my life, and that's why I'm not doing any more. So, returns to scale is a term referring to changes in output resulting from a proportional change in all the inputs. Diminishing returns is a single factor of production is increased, and yet your return is a lower yield. So it's actually a fairly simple guiding rule, and it's this graph. If your input is starting at 0, then you will go directly to the output, the volume of output. So if you started at 0 and you add an input, in this case it's a unique multiplier because there was nothing there before, 0, then you will get the full volume of the output. This is in fact what the diminishing returns curve looks like for the division, and I'll show you a bit more about this a little bit later. So at 0, full return, that's what you need to remember. If the bucket is empty, that's where you want to put your input. So the reason why damage to target out of cover is considered a better stat to get in many cases is not because it's multiplicative and weapon damage isn't. It's because the damage to target out of cover bucket is often quite empty. It's a very hard stat to come by. But in most cases, you will already have 10% on your weapon. And so adding Fox's prayers will give you a diminished return. You will not get the full 8% from the damage to targets out of cover that you're adding, but the diminishing is going to be very, very small because the bucket at only 10% is quite empty already. Whereas with weapon damage, in the same bucket you have all weapon damage, you have weapon damage, and you have also the specific weapon damage, so assault rifle or SMG, whatever it happens to be, whatever weapon you're using. All of those go into the same bucket, and they're very easy to come by. Any red core is going to add you more to the bucket. One single red core means that you have 15% in here, as opposed to the 10% that would have been in damage to targets out of cover from the weapon. So it's every single weapon core. And you also have the weapon itself, which gives you, when maxed out, at 15%. So this bucket fills up very, very quickly, and so everything that you add to it has a considerably more diminished return. Total weapon damage, a vigilance, if you add it for the very first time, as in a total weapon damage talent, you created this bucket for the first time, it will give you every single piece of that return that you ask for. But if you add vigilance and also obliterate 2 total weapon damage talents, you are going to get a diminished return because the bucket already has something in it. Now, amplified damage works in exactly the same way as the other ones, and I'll give you a good example in a second. But the power of amplified damage is that every new talent, very important, every new talent that is an amplified damage talent adds a new bucket. Every single time. So every single time you add an amplified talent that's different, you are going to get the full return from that bucket. You also have crit damage and headshot damage. Those are also, for some unknown reason, in the exact same bucket. So crit damage and headshot damage, any additions to that bucket in either the crit damage or the headshot damage will produce a diminished return. And a weapon system like an AR already has 90% headshot damage on it, or 70% headshot damage on it. Crit damage is another very easy to come by statistic. So this bucket is already very, very full before you even start adding to it. And then you also have the randomness of the applicability of whether or not you're getting a headshot, and also the random number generator that is crit chance as well. So this is a very variable diminished return investment, but still very, very powerful because of the amount of damage that it can provide. The numbers are much, much larger. So a great example of where amplified damage works in exactly the same way as the other ones, and it is filling from the same bucket, is the striker's backpack. And we'll use a simple example where I've got a 10% damage to targets out of cover. I have 100% weapon damage, and I have a 4-piece striker set that's giving me 65% amplified damage at full stacks. But I don't have the backpack and I don't have the chest piece. That gives me a total output of 363% damage. Now, if I add the backpack instead, so I replace one of those pieces with the backpack, I'm now getting a full 1% for every stack, which takes me up to 100% from 65%. So I've got 10% still on the damage to targets out of cover, I've still got 100% weapon damage, and I've got 100% amplified damage. Now this gives me 440% damage output. Now if I had gotten a true 35% amplified damage, if it had been a different category, a different talent, a 35% amplified damage talent, the addition of that 35% should have given me another 127% or thereabouts additional damage, but it didn't. I got less than 100, and that is because the 35% that I added received a diminished return. It's still more than 35% because it's still, the category is still multiplicative, so I'm still getting 100% multiplication on that 35%, and I'm still getting a 10% multiplication from the damage to targets out of cover, meaning that the output is more than 35%, but it's a diminished return from the full request that I asked as a result. So I get 440% damage output. And because of this confusion between amplified damage and all this sort of things, what people don't realize is that I've just added a new bucket, and the term that I've heard bantered around, which I think is a good one, is called a unique multiplier. I added a new bucket. It is unique to the build. I haven't got it yet. So the bucket is empty. There is no bucket. So now I've added a new bucket, or a unique multiplier, to my build, and now I get 454% damage because there is 0 by diminishing on the return that I've asked for, because it is a unique and brand new multiplier. So now the addition of a 25% unique multiplier gives me more than the 35% because it wasn't unique, and it produces a diminished return. So now if instead of the striker's backpack I'd put vigilance on instead, I would now be producing more damage. If I had added even a Fenris backpack with companion, the companion talent producing 15% total weapon damage is a unique multiplier, but I also get to get 10%, even though it's a diminished return because the bucket's already quite full. I'm now able to produce almost as much as what the 35% diminished return that I got from the striker's backpack. Very, very close. Now my favorite is the Memento backpack. Memento backpack provides no unique multiplier. the talent or the stacks that it gives you are also a diminished return. But the amount that they give you is quite considerable. At the 30 stacks, it'll give you a 30% enduring weapon damage bonus that lasts for 3 minutes. But every time you pick up a token, if you've got 6 red cores, it will add another 30% to that weapon damage. It's a diminished return because the bucket's already quite full, but the amount that it's giving you is quite large. Well, if I'm picking up tokens constantly, I'm getting an extra 32% damage output over and above what the Striker's Backpack is giving you. So if I have that buff constantly, I'm getting 32% more damage. So even if I'm picking up that only 50% of the time that I'm in combat, I'm still going to produce as much damage as what the Striker's Backpack does with the Memento Backpack. Because the Striker's Backpack is not a unique amplifier, a unique multiplier. You are adding to the same bucket and therefore getting a diminished return. It doesn't matter that it's amplified, it doesn't matter that it's weapon damage or detox. If you add to the same bucket, you will get to diminished returns. And so that's how I think it's easier to understand, rather than multiplicative or additive or anything like that. What you want, if you want more damage on your build, is more unique multipliers. Now, amplified damage is the easiest, or amplified damage talents, I should say, are the easiest way to get unique multipliers, because if it's a new talent, it creates a new unique, that's hard to say, a new unique multiplier. But if it's the same talent, so there are others that exist like this. The Strikers is an example, the ongoing directive chess piece is another example, and there are others, but it's the same bucket. So you're getting a diminished return. It's not a true amplified damage unique multiplier. If you want more damage on your build, add more unique multipliers to your build. Now, if you have to add to a bucket that already exists, the best way to get more damage is to add to the least full bucket. That's it. That's the simplest way to think about damage in this game. So before I showed you an overlay of the diminishing returns curve that applies to the Division 2. This isn't unique to the Division 2, but it will certainly help you. And how is it going to help you? So what I do is I find that the easiest way to do this is actually to do the inverse of the curve. And this will tell you the diminished return on everything that you want to add to your build. So I can very, very quickly tell you what's going to be better. So at 0, if you have nothing in your bucket, so your bucket is empty, if you're adding it for the very first time, you will get 100% return on investment. So let's take our Vigilance versus the 35% Striker's Backpack example. At 0, Vigilance, because it's the very first time that we're adding a total weapon damage talent, is 25%, so we're going to get 100% of that 25%. If we want to know how much we're going to get from our additional 35% that's going onto our 65, we move along the curve to the 65% mark. So we're adding it at the 65% mark, and what it means is that we're going to get just over 60% return on our 35%. So we do just over 60% return on our 35%, which means is we do 60, let's say 61% times our 35 means that we'll only get 21.35% return. So it's better to put on Vigilance. Okay, we want to know how much we're going to get by picking up a token of a Memento Backpack. So we come along to the 130% because that's where we were before, and we know that it's going to add another 30%, but we're going to get roughly a 44% return on that 30%. Sweet. What are we going to get? We're going to get 44 times 35. Correction. We're going to get 30%, but it's going to be diminished to 44% of its original return, so we're only going to get 13.2% on our output. Okay, so we're looking at the Striker's backpack example. Our output was 363%. And we worked out that we were going to get a 21 point something return. 363 times 1.21 equals, oh, look at that, 439%. Or it's actually 440% damage. Let's look at our memento example. So 417 was our base example, and what did we say it was? It was 44% of our 30, meaning we're getting 13.2%, so 417 times 1.13 equals, look at that, 472%. So once you know what your output is, you will immediately be able to tell what the new output is. Now in this case, I've calculated that the difference is going to be the output is 363% damage. You don't need to do the calculations. You can literally just go to the firing range and fire one bullet, and you will know what the output of the system is. And then, using the diminished returns curve, you will be able to see what the new damage is without even actually firing the bullet. So let's just simply say that it's 363,000 for the bullet, 363,000. The 35% that we had, or that we're trying to calculate, is diminished to just over 60%. So that's a 21% return. If it's 363,000 for the bullet, times 1.21, the new bullet with the addition of the extra stacks will be 439,000. Let's compare it to the addition of the companion backpack with an additional 10% weapon damage. So, go back to our curve. Now our 15% companion, we know it's the first time that we're adding total weapon damage, so it's going to be 15%. But we want to know how much our 10% additional weapon damage is going to give us. So we go to the 100, and look at that, it's exactly 50%, so it's going to give us 5%. So we say it is, because they are multiplicative, it is going to be 5% times the 15%. That gives us 20.75% is what's going to be the output, or change in our volume of output. 20.75, I go back here. So originally it was 363. 363 times 1.2075 equals 438% is the new output. Easy. Diminished returns. And before anybody puts it in the comment, it's not a fundamental understanding. I understand that this is in fact the differential between multiplicative and additive, but it is a much easier way to understand what's going on in this game, and a much easier way to calculate what it is that you're actually trying to get to, which is, what is the best thing that I can add to my build? I'll sit on this screen for a little bit, just so if you want to screen capture it, you can, but it's actually very easy to graph, because all you're doing is the 0 point is 100% base damage, and you add 10%, and then work out what the 10% that you've added is as a total of the whole. So as you are adding, it's becoming less and less of the whole that you've added. Every single increment is another 10% that you've added. So very easily you can plot this. At 100 it's going to be 50. At 200 it's going to be 33.33333. At 300 it is 0.25. And that is because it is 3 times the base at 300%, which means that the total will be 400. So whatever you're adding is coming out to be 1/4 of its base value. It's 1/3 of its value because this is now 3 times, because you've added 200% to the 100%, so it's a 300% total. At 100, it is 50% because you've doubled the total volume of output. Diminished returns. Here's the graph. Use it wisely. If you like the tool, then like. If you want to subscribe, that's all well and good, but there's only going to be one more video. But I will see you in the last video coming soon. Fog out.